Welcome to the Courageous Conversations podcast, hosted by me, Hannah Chadwick, the director and founder of Fortitude Training. In each episode, I'll be sharing my tales, tips, and techniques with the hope that they'll help you make your work life more positive and productive. I hope you're able to find the hidden gems that you can learn from and utilise to positively impact both your personal and professional life. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics like workplace culture, well-being, diversity, leadership, and team building. Episodes will be a mixture of me sharing stories from my own personal and professional experience, and me interviewing guests, where they're sharing their lived experience insights. I hope you're able to find the hidden gems that you can utilise to positively impact your personal and professional life. Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Courageous Conversations podcast. To those of you who are returning listeners, welcome back. And to any new listeners, hello and welcome. I'm your host, Hannah Chadwick, founder of Fortitude Training. Remember, if you haven't already done so, to please tap the subscribe button so you'll never miss an episode. And whilst you're there, why not leave a rating and review, as any feedback that you can leave me would really help. We'll kick things off with the rundown of this week's good news stories. Then we'll move on to today's courageous conversation, during which I'll be sharing with you the 10 signs of a toxic workplace culture. Then we'll have this week's hero of the week, and finally we'll wrap things up on a positive note. So without further ado, this is the rundown. So this week we saw Chancellor Rishi Sunak launch his Eat Out to Help Out campaign here in the UK in a bid to give the finances of food outlets a much needed boost. The scheme runs until the 31st of August and offers diners half-price meals when they eat in at participating establishments. Secondly, a 10-year-old Leeds boy was rescued by the RNLI when he got swept out to sea during a family day trip out to Scarborough. Thankfully, the quick-thinking youngster survived for more than an hour by recalling some floating advice he'd seen on a documentary. And finally, a boyfriend melted hearts this week in a viral video where his girlfriend, who's an alopecia sufferer, asked him to shave her head. Immediately after finishing shaving her head, he took the clippers to his own hair in a sign of solidarity. So without further ado, let's get into today's courageous conversation, 10 signs of a toxic workplace culture. Okay, now I'm not just talking about that usual Monday morning misery that the Boomtown Rats sang about in their timeless classic hit, I Don't Like Mondays. Yes, it's natural to feel disheartened when the weekend seems to whiz past in the blink of an eye, while the work week can feel like a never-ending marathon of meetings, to-do lists, and every email that you action seems to be swiftly replaced with another 10 new ones. Most of us have overcome the Monday morning dread by the time we've downed our first Costa and caught up with our colleagues about last Friday's episode of Gogglebox. I'm talking about a workplace culture where low morale, negative attitudes, high sickness absence, and poor staff retention rates are the norm. And if you think the what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas approach applies to toxic workplace environments, think again. That energy most definitely follows you home, whether it's in the form of stress, anxiety, sleep deprivation, or impacting your relationships with friends and family. In severe cases, when left unaddressed, the effects can culminate in serious health problems such as depression or even a full-blown breakdown. So let's dig a little deeper and try and ascertain whether your workplace might have a toxic culture. Number 1, poor communication. As we've seen demonstrated by the various leaders across the world during this global pandemic, inadequate, confusing, or piecemeal communication is often the root cause to so many problems. Remember the Matt Lucas parody of Boris Johnson's "go to work, don't go to work" message that he delivered in the daily coronavirus briefing? It's also very underrated. After all, communication is something that we all do on a daily basis. So hey, no point in paying for training for it, right? Wrong. Communication is a vital skill that so many of us whack in the old CV. I'm an effective communicator. I'm able to communicate with people from all different levels. When in actual fact, our communication skills are often average at best. So why is this? Well, there are so many factors affecting our communication style. Our personality types, how we communicate with other personality types, whether we listen to respond or listen to understand, whether we prefer verbal or written communication. Some of us are keyboard warriors, but we hate speaking over the phone or face-to-face. Others can talk your ears off, but barely give you a full sentence in a text or email. So how can you identify if there's a communication problem in your organisation? Let's look at a few examples. If your employees are all based in the same time zone, your out-of-hours emailing and work is the norm, you might have a communication problem. Passive-aggressive communications, particularly over email, are another sign. Needlessly CCing or even BCCing all and sundry into emails. Inconsistent messages being received by different staff. Staff feeling unclear or unsure about what they should be doing. People ignoring other people's communications or not actively listening to verbal communications. Poor communication is often the foreshadow to other signs of a toxic workplace culture that usually follow it. Top tip. If your organisation is experiencing poor communication, act quickly, as if you fail to do so, the problem will fester and spread. Whether it's having more frequent communication channels, such as email briefings or team get-togethers, participating in team building activities, or arranging some communication skills training, it's vital that you take action to improve this, otherwise it's going to permeate other areas of your business too. Number 2, cliques and office gossip are the norm. Now, don't get me wrong, it's only natural that we have some colleagues that we have a closer bond with or have a good bit of banter with than others. But that's very different to the behaviour that is often commonplace in some organisations, with gossip, arguments and backstabbing being the norm. It can feel like a flashback to high school, or be reminiscent of movies like Mean Girls. And make no mistake, this type of behaviour isn't just limited to the ladies. I've experienced firsthand cliques and gossip that's been perpetuated around the office by blokes. We all know the drill. The in-jokes that they don't want to share, yet they're happy to laugh about in mixed company. The drinks runs and the lunches that only ever include them. The whispering, looking over at someone else, then bursting into fits of laughter. Or when you walk in a room and then they suddenly stop talking, right? You'd be forgiven for mistaking the office for a primary school playground with the way some cliques behave. And as petty as it sounds, it can feel extremely isolating when you're working in the midst of a clique. Clique warning signs include lunches and drinks runs that only include a chosen few, making people feel excluded, whether in general or from specific conversations, preferential treatment of members of the group, such as giving them preferred work, even where they're not necessarily best suited to the task. Excessive unnecessary messaging between the clique during office hours, over email, the telephone and messaging platforms. Whispering to each other when in the presence of non-clique members. Only being willing to interact with other members of the team when there's an opportunity to find out gossip or stir the pot. Top tip. If you're in HR or a leader, ignore cliques at your peril. Do so, and sooner or later, you'll be the one having to deal with the grievances, resignations, and recruiting new staff when the non-clique members get sick and tired of being excluded. And if this behaviour is being exhibited at a more senior level, then good luck, because frankly, you're going to need it. Number 3, lackluster leadership. As the saying goes, people don't quit their jobs, they quit their bosses. I've definitely been there, done that, got the t-shirt. My bad boss situation landed my employer in an employment tribunal, having to pay me for a constructive dismissal claim and disability discrimination. So I know firsthand how important it is to address poor leadership issues. There can be a host of reasons for someone not being a good leader, enough to cover in a separate episode in its entirety, but here are some of the common circumstances that I've encountered. They were good at their job, so they got promoted to management, but they're not a leader. Anyone can be a manager, but not everybody has leadership qualities. Far too often, people get rewarded for doing some aspects of their job well, and they get offered a management role. But actually, they might have no clue or desire to lead people. Or maybe they've never had management training. When someone decides they want to be a driver, we don't just give them a set of keys and say, off you go. We put them through a series of tests to assess their competence and capability. Because drivers, much like managers, don't just affect themselves if things go wrong. If a driver gets into a wreck, chances are they may injure somebody else or damage someone's property in the process. The same goes for managers. If they don't know what they're doing, and suddenly they're responsible for all these people, if they don't know how to handle things like empathy, motivating others, constructive feedback, to name a few, chances are they'll be leading their team to failure. It still astounds me that in 2020 we still have managers, new and existing, who've never had so much as a sniff of leadership or management training. Maybe they want to micromanage everything that everyone does, slowing down progress and eroding team morale. Or maybe it's the, it's not me, it's them boss. Yes, these types wouldn't know accountability if it bit them in the backside. Unless, of course, things are going well and there's praise on offer, in which case these types are only too happy to take all the credit. If you're a leader and something goes wrong, it's your fault, not your team's. You're the captain of the ship, so it's your job to go down with it if needs be. Top tip. Lackluster leadership is a surefire sign of a toxic workplace. If your organisation offers skip-level meetings, try discussing your concerns in those. Or maybe try tactfully approaching your concerns using 360-degree feedback if you've been selected to provide feedback about your manager. If things are really bad, try consulting HR. But beware, HR is not your friend. They're there to act in the interests of the organisation. Sometimes HR themselves can be the ones that are contributing to the toxic behaviours and attitudes. Number 4, disengaged workforce. If staff are showing low morale, aren't motivated and are generally producing pretty sloppy output, chances are they've mentally checked out. There can be various causes, such as a lack of feedback, or unbalanced feedback, receiving tellings off but never praise, unrealistic goals or targets, lack of clarity, or seeing bad behaviour in others being rewarded or overlooked. Disengaged staff are like an infection that can spread to your most hard-working and committed staff too, as nothing is likely to get their backs up more than seeing that they're working 2 times harder than their colleague who's doing the same role. Soon enough, they'll check out too if the situation isn't addressed. Top tip. Try to re-engage your workforce by having a frank discussion where you acknowledge the mistakes of the past and agree on a way forward together, whether that's improving comms, adjusting targets, or participating in team-building exercises, just to get everyone back on the same page again. As humans, we're naturally cooperative, not combative. We want to feel part of a collective, so bringing everyone together and clearing the air gives you the chance to get on one accord again. Number 5, lack of development opportunities. Even a fairly good workplace can feel toxic to an employee who shows potential, has bags of ambition, but isn't provided with opportunities for growth. Don't get me wrong, some people are quite happy to do the same job day in, day out and get their regular paycheck. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that works for them, fine. But some employees need to feel like they're on a journey and will naturally want to acquire new knowledge, skills and abilities along the way. If they see these opportunities simply aren't available or accessible to them, they'll happily work for your competitor who is willing to provide their employees with professional development opportunities, taking all that knowledge and experience with them in the process, and leaving you with a position to fill and possibly an agency fee too. Top tip. With so many heavily subsidised apprenticeships, and these aren't just for young people or new starters by the way, but for anybody who has an appropriate knowledge gap that can be filled by the qualification, it's never been easier or more affordable for employers to invest in their staff development. And on this note, make sure that any development or progression opportunities you present to an employee are genuine. I've definitely been the person who's been fooled into hanging on by my manager on the promise of opportunities that never materialised. Whilst twiddling my thumbs and waiting for those ever-elusive roles, I missed out on real progression opportunities in other organisations. It's unfair and underhand to do this, so don't ever be tempted to do so. Number 6. High attrition rates. Low staff retention, particularly where it's heavily concentrated in a particular team, is a surefire indicator that you've got a toxic workplace on your hands. Now yes, I'll agree that the world of work looks very different to that which our parents and grandparents experienced. In the main, they worked for the same maybe 1 or 2 employers over the entire course of their career. In contrast, younger people, and millennials in particular, are not shy to move around different organisations in order to meet their career development and progression objectives. Quitting your job isn't something that most of us do without a great deal of consideration. Let's face it, having a CV that features more jobs than Elizabeth Taylor had husbands doesn't exactly paint you in the best light when you're looking for your next opportunity. And making lots of sideways moves without good reason, such as relocation or redundancy, to name a few, can be an indicator that you're trying to break away from unhealthy workplaces. Likewise, frequently having to dismiss staff can be indicative of more deep-rooted problems. If employees are repeatedly failing, to the point that dismissal is the only option, that suggests that there are failings in leadership. And lest we not forget, whether you lose staff because they jump or because they've been pushed, either way, you as the employer lose thousands of pounds every time this cycle occurs. That money's lost in re-advertising positions, time spent sifting CVs and interviewing, recruiter fees, paying the leaver unused holidays, the wind-down period during their notice, where they're probably not going to be at their most productive, any downtime where the position's unfilled, and the 3 to 6 months it roughly takes for the replacement to settle in. All things said, high staff turnover is a costly game to be playing. Top tip: multiple staff bolting for the nearest exit tells you you've got a problem on your hands. Sending a leavers questionnaire or doing an exit interview in their last few days of work isn't enough. The employee will have emotionally checked out by that point, and frankly, they probably won't even care to help you get to grips with what's going on that's caused them to leave in the first place. They may not even fill in the form or attend the interview. Make sure you're consulting with any staff who've resigned in the early days of them submitting their notice, where there's more chance of salvaging the relationship or at least establishing the drivers that have motivated them to leave. And if you're not even conducting leaver questionnaires or exit interviews, you need to ask yourself why. Maybe you already know full well what's wrong and you don't want to address it. Number 7. There's no such thing as work-life balance. Employees can only give you the best of what they have to offer if they benefit from getting the proper rest outside of their working hours. The working time regulations were created for a reason. As I discussed in last week's episode, I experienced for myself the perilous consequences of working a job where there's no opportunity to switch off. Over the years, I damaged my physical and mental health, and I saw countless other colleagues doing exactly the same thing. I also know how severely this imbalance can impact your family life. My family couldn't stand the person that I became when I was working my last job. It's embarrassing to admit it, but the job got the best of me and my family got what was left of me. I barely had the enthusiasm to make polite small talk with them. If anything, I was angry that they were distracting me from my work. I didn't have time to cook, so we went from eating nutritious home-cooked meals to living off takeaways and processed rubbish. I didn't want to do things at the weekends, like shopping and visiting family. Instead, I stayed at home so I could squeeze in a few more hours' work. Or if I wasn't working, I felt guilty and regretted it later, so I'd be in a foul mood. I'd become so far removed from the wife and mum that I'd always been previously, and that I am now. No employee should be expected to be on 24/7. This isn't the Devil Wears Prada. Granted, there may be occasional situations that arise that might require your attention outside of working hours, but this should be on an ad hoc basis, the exception, not the rule. Top tip: as an employer, you set the tone for what's expected from your people. Treat people with respect and kindness, knowing that doing so will pay dividends in terms of the output that they'll give you in their office hours. And importantly, if you frequently see your staff working outside their contracted hours, ask them why. Maybe they need help or support with their workload. Maybe they're experiencing personal problems such as presenteeism. And make sure that you're paying your staff for any extra time worked or giving them time back in lieu. Otherwise, before long, the cumulative effect of all those unpaid working hours could just land you in the employment tribunal with a claim for breaching the working time regulations. If you want a team of robots, buy them. But don't treat your staff like objects. They're real people with real lives outside of your business hours. Number 8. Staff are burning out left, right and centre. Burnout could be reflective of an individual and their ability to thrive or survive in a particular role. But where staff are dropping like flies, or you're getting lots of frequent sickness absences, or people are using their annual leave for no other reason than they just don't want to be at work, chances are your toxic workplace culture is causing your staff to burn out. There are varying degrees of burnout, and it's not always through overwork. Even employees who feel unstimulated and under-challenged can suffer from burnout, as the mundane nature of their never-changing work life can cause them to suffer from low mood, which can escalate if left unaddressed. Likewise, we've probably all seen or even been that person who's worked their proverbial socks off on a project, on the promise or in the hope of some recognition or reward further down the line. That often doesn't materialise. The come-down effect of that situation can have devastating effects on employees' health and well-being. No work-life balance and burnout often tend to go hand in hand. Some people are in a role that places such intense demands on their time that they constantly feel burnt out, but almost become resigned to that fact and are unable to get off the treadmill, so they just keep going. Top tip: if you see or suspect that any of your people might be suffering from burnout, it's vital that you promptly address it with them. Establish what support measures you can put in place. Note that they may be reluctant to admit that there's a problem, so you might have to do some reassuring to get it out of them. But remember, you owe a duty of care to your employees, and burnout isn't something that's going to get better on its own. Besides, who do you think is going to produce a better output for you? Someone suffering from burnout, or someone who's happy and feels they've got a manageable workload? And if you're dealing with burnout yourself, if you haven't already done so, speak to your employer to see what support they can offer you. If you've already tried that to no avail, you need to seriously think about getting out of the situation before it takes an irreversible toll on your physical and mental health. Number 9, Sicifian behaviour. I love teaching people about the ancient Greek tale of King Sisyphus in my communication skills workshop. The tale goes that King Sisyphus thought he could outsmart the gods. His punishment was being condemned to eternally rolling a giant boulder up a hill. Every time he neared the top, the boulder rolled back down the hill, meaning his task was everlasting and futile. The story resonates with me because my last job represents the epitome of Sicifian behaviour. Every time something critical went wrong and you reported it to the necessary people in the hope that they would investigate and put appropriate measures in place, they just did nothing. Every time the same problems rolled around, the same result ensued. Maybe it's my legal background. We're typically sticklers for the rules and very process-driven. Thinking about it, these recurring problems only ever seem to irritate my fellow legal trainer colleagues. In the legal profession, when things go wrong or don't produce the output you're expecting, you undertake root cause analysis so you can establish what's gone wrong and why, and hopefully avoid it happening again in future. This was not the case here. Top tip: it seems obvious, but if things are going wrong in your organisation and your staff are reporting it to you, you need to take action. Do some root cause analysis if necessary, or follow up on whatever the problem is. And if things are going wrong in your organisation and no one's telling you, chances are your team have already checked out. Maybe it's because of previous Sicifian behaviour or poor communication, or a combination of both. They've probably stopped caring themselves, or they're under the impression that maybe you don't care. Either way, you lose, so it's necessary to address it. Number 10, favoritism. This can manifest in various different ways. It could be that no matter how hard you work, you never get recognition or promotions, whilst incompetence and bad behaviour seems to get rewarded in other colleagues. Remember that I mentioned earlier that I took a former employer to a tribunal because of my boss? What I didn't say was, in the very same week that the tribunal announced how much compensation they were awarding me, I got a text from one of my old direct reports. She said that a company-wide email had just gone out advising that my old boss had now been promoted to head of department. Seemingly, it didn't matter how much money she'd just cost them in the tribunal, not to mention their legal fees, time spent, and damage to their reputation. They were happy to back her because of favoritism. Favoritism can manifest in other ways too. It might be that the yes people get well thought of, whereas people who aren't jumping to agree because they're critical thinkers or have more than a shred of integrity often come off worst for being honest. Or maybe it looks like preferential treatment for certain people or groups. I can remember seeing colleagues who were pally with the directors because of the proximity that their role provided. They'd get taken out for extended lunches, sometimes even of the liquid kind, whilst such behaviour was expressly prohibited for all other staff, whose comings and goings were monitored on reports. Or I've seen call centre environments where lower-ranking staff were barely given adequate time to use the bathroom, whilst more senior staff and the chosen few were allowed to drift in and out as they pleased, with frequent trips to coffee shops and cigarette breaks being commonplace. Top tip: favoritism doesn't go unnoticed in the workplace. Even if staff don't vocalise their complaints, Rest assured, they'll see it and will have an opinion on the disparity in treatment. They may stage their protest by being less productive, essentially slacking off, or maybe they'll spend hours and hours discussing how fair it is. Either way, they're affecting your productivity. They'll eventually vote with their feet and jump ship to work at a more equal organisation. Well, that's the end of my top 10 signs of a toxic workplace culture. If you're seeing some of these characteristics presenting in your organisation, it's my sincere hope that you're able to utilise these tips to try and eradicate that toxicity and get your workplace looking shipshape again. And if you feel like you want to make some changes, but just don't know where to start, why not drop me a DM to arrange a free discovery session so we can plan a way forward together. Now it's time for Hero of the Week. This week's award goes to Northamptonshire Police Officers PCs Sandra Payne and James Condon. This past week, they pulled over a driver when his vehicle registration indicated he had no insurance. On speaking to the driver, he insisted that he'd insured the car that morning. Then the man's pregnant wife called to say that she'd just gone into labour. The officers dashed straight to the couple's home and helped to safely deliver baby Harris before ambulance crews arrived. After the speedy delivery, the driver was able to show his insurance certificate to the officers. That situation could have gone awry in so many different ways, but it just goes to show that there are good and honest people in this world. And that concludes episode 2 of the Courageous Conversations podcast. And please remember to subscribe for free on your preferred platform and to leave a rating or review if you enjoyed the show. I'll leave you with today's positive note, which is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort or convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Courageous Conversations podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to access your podcasts. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. Don't forget to tune in to next week's episode, and until then, take care. Bye for now.